So what I wanted to do today, and I appreciate you all, checking this out, is that I wanted to um, bring to this platform something I had written and presented a couple of years ago, in part because some of the issues I was unfortunately reminded of them recently, because the issues that were raised in this presentation have really just intensified in just a couple of years since I gave it. So anyway, I appreciate you all, checking this out, and I'm happy to get your comments and questions and criticisms as we go through it. And I think I can add a little bit of context to it. The link to the text is in the show notes for you to go back at your leisure. And again, it's titled Degrees of Propaganda, the University and Public Opinion. And it was a talk I initially gave on invitation of the Faculty Senate at Howard University on March 29th, 2019. And I was appreciative. I remain appreciative of that invitation because I think we have to be real. I think I need to be real here that in terms of the academic community, I prefer to put it this way. I have understandably, justifiably not produced in such a way as to get many of these invitations. That my level of academic production frankly doesn't warrant the kinds of invitations that others get to speak to their peers in the academic arena, that is. So anyway, so when it happens, I appreciate being able to speak to my peers in those spaces, and especially when on these kinds of invitations, where I'll say it's sort of an under or unspoken invitation to say things to another university's faculty on behalf of faculty there that wouldn't be able to get away with saying it themselves. Because the point that I do want to come back to and continue to highlight is just the simple fact that within the academic world, there is neighborhood dogs. There is far less freedom and power than I think is often thought to be, for in terms of those who are not in the academy. Most people don't have the kind of they don't have the ability without risk to say certain things or to take certain positions academically, etc. So the flip side is I have attained sort of somewhat of a rare position of being a full professor and tenured, which does have certain protections, not as many as some might think, and it doesn't have all the perks that some might think in certainly in my context. But at the same time, it gives me a little more latitude than a lot of folks, even within the academy. Relative to working people outside of the academy, I am as free and as powerful and free and powerful as you could expect a working person to get. But within academia, it's a little bit not quite that. All right. Anyway, so I started here by saying that when Black scholars hear the call to equal opportunity in darkness, when Black scholars hear the call to equal opportunity in darkness, they must remember that they do not belong in the darkness of an American culture that refuses to move toward the light. They are not meant to be pliant captives and agents of institutions that deny light all over the world. No, they must speak the truth to themselves and to the community and to all who invite them into the new darkness. They must affirm the light movement of their past, the light movement of their people. They must affirm their capacities to move forward toward new alternatives for light in America. This is quoting Vincent Harding in his introduction to Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. So then I went on to say, please allow me to first thank Dr. Walters and the Faculty Senate here at Howard University for this invitation. In truth, there are times when it feels as though I'm in my own institutional darkness. So I certainly hope that if others here or elsewhere ever feel the same, that I can speak some truth to us all in what then would be for me a new darkness. I intend to briefly summarize and develop 3 tracks of overlapping thought. 1, an acknowledgement of a continuing context of colonialism or colonization. 2, the impact of that context on the developed role of the university and specifically the HBCU. And 3, the specific function played by propaganda in the maintenance of that institutional role. In preparing some comments for today, I thought first of a recent interview I conducted with a friend and former colleague, Dr. Jelani Favors, about his new book, Shelter in a Time of Storm: How Black Colleges Foster Generations of Leadership and Activism. And in particular, a point of disagreement, one I have found runs through my work and experience as an academic, an activist, and a journalist. That is the difference in emphasis between initial intent and impact or effect. That is a difference in the difference in emphasis between initial intent and impact or effect. I do want to quickly say that a big shout out to Dr. Favors, and what from my vantage point, speaking again entirely from my narrow and limited view, Dr. Favors, I think, is one of the many who was done unfairly by the history department at Morgan State University at that time. This is some years ago, when he just, long story short, I just don't think he, like many of us, are given the appropriate room to develop what are standards for tenure and promotion that are consistent with the broader university system, but are inconsistent with the realities of a faculty member at an HBCU or at Morgan State. So it's unfortunate that Dr. Favors, I think, again, and I don't know all the details, but from my vantage point, I wasn't even in the history department, you know, when all this was going down, but I just, you know, knew Dr. Favors at Morgan, and I understood the context. That it's unfortunate that he had to leave Morgan to produce this work, which, despite this disagreement that I'm about to get into, briefly at least, is really strong and really important. And I just think, you know, he deserved to be able to finish that or to do that kind of work while still at Morgan. Specifically, Jelani Favors, Dr. Favors, argued against the previous work on the history of Black universities in the United States of William Watkins, arguing that, like many, he too accepted the dominant narrative that these spaces were bastions of conservatism constructed either through white philanthropic efforts or by the order of white politicians. Many of these studies have confined their analysis to contrasting vocational training with the liberal arts, which causes many to miss what Favors describes as the HBCU's second curriculum, one that saw teachers and students engaged in a struggle to link the fate of the race to the curriculum. From there, Favors argues HBCUs would play a central role in advancing the political and social struggles of Africans in America, my phrasing, until some important post-Black power era institutional shifts, a point to which I will return. So in other words, Dr. Favors and I disagreed, and a poorly preserved interview that I did with him on this is on iMixWhatILike.org, and I got to get him on to come back to this and do this again. But where we disagreed was that he was saying that Watkins was not fair to the history of HBCUs by summarizing them as merely being bastions of conservatism constructed either through white philanthropic efforts or by the order of white politicians, and that Watkins and others like myself, who don't pay enough attention to what Favors calls the second curriculum, don't pay enough attention to how HBCUs provided, particularly early on, you know, the safe space for Black people to learn in an unhostile environment, to be encouraged to learn to read and do you know, math and science in a loving and constructive, supportive environment, and in other words, to support the second curriculum of pro-race development. And this is why I'm saying that while it's not that I don't acknowledge that, it's that my emphasis is is consistent across the board on this issue and others, particularly when it comes to propaganda, that I'm not questioning whether whether the impact was always successful from the point of view of those in power. I'm questioning or wanting us to focus on what the intent was and is. So I'm less interested in again, the historically accurate references to positive experiences Black people have had in these institutions. I'm more interested in almost exclusively, which could be a fault, in focusing on the intent of the institution. So same thing with propaganda, which we'll come back to. I'm less interested in people's ability to elide the horrors of propagandized messaging, psychological warfare, etc., and than I am in the intent in the first place that be the goal or taking place from the perspective of those in power. Because I think if we don't do that, we lose sight of the context and the political struggle that we need to develop to respond to it. All right. So, however, where I disagree with Favors and others is in the area of emphasis, where I find the tendency to focus on the making of the best of a bad situation tends to entirely supplant focus on what precedes that need. Analysis for me requires that intent is supreme. So when Watkins writes in White Architects of Black Education that the founders of what would become today's collection of HBCUs were developed on models that, quote, represented classic colonialism, end quote, he appropriately shows where our analyses must start and finish, as opposed to the ability of some to transcend. By the way, my goodness, I've been doing, oh man, sorry for this. I've been doing, man, I've been trying to do too many things, but in trying to get ready for the second edition of the MOBP, I am seeing, I'm looking more at some of these arguments which have been sent me since the publication of the first edition, which have meant to argue against my argument, but most of them are sort of the cultural studies analyses, where we get positive references to Nicki Minaj and her what are her followers called again? The Barbs, who defend her as you know, transcending some you know, phallocentric white supremacist approach to women, and to contort in a positive way the capitalist intent to reduce us all to consumers, and to you know, and that she and women like that subvert these intentions in some meaningful positive. I get that that's possible and in pockets exists. And I don't mean, and I'm certainly not blaming Nicki Minaj for it, for anything really, but I am saying that I think that largely misses the point. Those arguments, I'm sorry, they don't move me. And again, I think they miss the point. And then anyway, they do what I'm saying here. So I'm just, anyway, sorry about that. Anyway. So of course, this is not to say pay no attention, offer up no praise. No, I'm speaking specifically of emphasis and analysis. The intent of these universities was to serve a colonial function, which continues today of necessity, given there has yet been no successful revolutionary adjustment of the national political trajectory. Or as Russell Maroon Schultz writes of violence, its scientific opposite is not nonviolence or the absence of violence, but counter-violence, or the appropriate social application of Isaac Newton's physical laws regarding equal and opposite force to stop what is already in motion. Similarly, despite valiant efforts to the contrary still ongoing, the founding colonial principles of the U.S. and its institutions, and of course its universities, including HBCUs, remain intact, and the activism my brother and colleague Dr. Favors emphasizes was contrary to his focus, for me, born of broader national and international political movements forcing their way onto campus, not the other way around, and were themselves in response to that initial intent, that colonizing function. Campus movements were meant to be, as many who would evolve in the Africana Studies movement would attest, the intellectual wing of the Black liberation struggle. In other words, HBCUs didn't produce the revolution, as much good as they may have or continue to do. I wanted to start there because in my own work, some produce, some not. be that in communication or media studies or Africana studies, my preference, which has not gone unchallenged by any means, is that focus be placed on the intent of power, the owners of the means of production, or as Karl Marx has also said, the means of mental production. In fact, I've come to abhor arguments about agency unless it has intelligence in front of it. I actually like that line. I don't usually make myself laugh, and I'm not usually that I don't know, proud of something I've written, but I actually like that line. I have come to abhor arguments about agency unless it has intelligence in front of it, if for no other reason that such approaches seem to discourage institutional analyses. Yes, we as individuals can make some choices, do have, if not free, ranges of thought, which may not be fully prescribed, but this should not mean we de-emphasize in any way the tremendous energy always being put to managing our behavioral outcomes in favor of an extant process of colonization. So when Watkins describes the colonial origins of the HBCU, he again correctly situates the problem. The United States is an aspiring empire historically and a rivaled but still singular and dominant global force today, does what empires do. They establish subjects, not citizens, and relate to those subjects as target populations. With his media scholar Chris Simpson has said, a philosophy of communication is domination, largely preparing them, us, for our role in the extractive relationships colonialism develops. The cultural and material productive capabilities of these populations must be set for appropriation, extraction, and popular symbolic representation that, as Fanon described, testifies against the colonized original. So specific to my own generational example, related well to this talk, very little of my professional HBCU experience reflects what I grew up watching on a different world. That truly must have been a different world. So please do. I've already put the link in the description below. This talk was one of the part of the impetus behind that project. Please do click the link for the Not a Different World project if you have any experience with HBCUs, student, parent, faculty, admin, staff, etc. I would definitely want to hear from you as part of this long-form longitudinal project that is still ongoing. And thank you very much. Communication as domination in this country begins immediately. As Chela Sandoval has said, we are all being located for assignment from birth, then targeted with a national anthem that makes absent its revealing third verse, which would remind us of the violent threats levied against enslaved Africans and poor whites who went off by the thousands to fight with the British. And that third verse is a beast. And I got to shout out Dr. Sundiata Chajuwa years ago when he was still with the Black Scholar. He is the one that put me on to this. I had never read the third verse, but when you read it, it's wild. And even to have students go through and read it, it's wild. So again, even before Colin Kaepernick, I was not standing for the national anthem, and in part it has to do with me wanting to adhere to a tradition I always heard from my father, was a part of, not standing for it. But once I read that third verse, I was like, it's a wrap. Like Francis Scott Key, was racist. His connections by family and marriage, I believe, to Justice Taney, the Dred Scott judge, is evident in the goal of the anthem and Francis Scott Key's work. And even the fact that he was not a captive on that boat, he was there as an emissary of the rich white plantocracy, trying to work out a deal with the British so that they could maintain enslavement, that they could protect. He was trying to protect slavery. So the national anthem is so much propaganda and psychological warfare. It's worthy of ignoring and not standing for, long before, with all due respect, Colin Kaepernick and everything that's going on recently. It should never. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible anthem. Written by an equally horrible person. So anyway, knowledge of this would make more palpable the work of Gerald Horne, who describes a counter-revolution of 1776, one that, contrary to popular mythology for African people, for Black people, enshrined enslavement toward a permanent denial of freedom. We still struggle to realize this in part because of what Patricia Bradley has described in her work, Propaganda and Slavery, as the metaphor of slavery. This skillfully developed mechanism of the 18th century prepared whites to fight whites by making reference to enslavement in their newspapers, pamphlets, and sermons, but carefully and only in the context of their white colonist servitude to the British. The actual enslavement and broader conditions of Black people were unmentioned. So much so that when Paul Revere made his famous ride, it was with the earliest in colonized rebranding that he made Crispus Attucks white in his print, sacrificing Attucks's Blackness for the sake of symbolic support for the project of galvanizing white anti-British sentiment to propel their white rebellion. After all that, what can anyone say today about Ben Affleck playing Tony Mendez in Argo, or Johnny Depp as Tonto, or Christian Bale as Moses? Wow, this is deep. So this is interesting. I forgot about this part. So shout out to Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows, who years ago put me onto the literature about Paul Revere. Shout out to Patricia Bradley, who I've never met, but her work on propaganda and slavery has been instrumental for me and continues to be. And when you read about Sam Adams, the Dave Chappelle sketch mocking Sam Adams as Sam Jackson's beer is even funnier. And Sam Adams was just a white supremacist propagandist trying to, again, paint slavery only in the context of what the British were doing to his fellow white landowners. And was someone who supported through propaganda and otherwise the institution of slavery. And then how funny is this Johnny Depp as Tonto? I forgot about that. So as he gets a positive rebranding in this Amber Heard trial, can't forget that you did this though, homeboy. And Ben Affleck, I guess all this time he's spending with J-Lo got him thinking he could get away with this. After all, Jenny from the block said my niggas, right? At one point, didn't she? What was that? Yeah, anyway. So they're just all, it's like a family of line steppers now. Anyway. It is here that the genius of Cedric Robinson and a brief summary of his Black Marxism is particularly relevant. The advent of this country, as is the case with any, has accompanied its own particular mythology. As Robinson said, quote, "It is by now generally understood that the formation of nation states and political reigns precipitate the development of founding myths of origin. Though the process may have been obscured by time and in more distant eras, the emergences of bourgeoisies of the 18th and 19th centuries made it explicit," end quote. For us here today, a focus on the national mythology of racial hierarchy, the role of the university and that of the Black scholar is of particular relevance. In a twist of Noam Chomsky's point about there needing to be greater degrees of propaganda in societies claiming democracy and freedom, the national mythology had to be evolved and weaponized as African people moved from official forms of outright enslavement to those more indirect and sophisticated, but no less extractive or wealth-producing forms of managing social order. Robinson continues, during the era that followed enslavement, when manufacturing became the most advanced form of production and democratic institutions the most significant political creed, the African was represented as chattel in their economic image, as slaves in their political and social image, as brutish and therefore inaccessible to further development, and finally as Negro, that is, without history. And later, during the industrialization of the country's economy, when individuality and manipulative acumen were at a premium, the Black was a pathetic sharecropper, unskilled and unambitious, the happy darkies for whom the society possessed a paternalistic obligation. Finally, in our own time, with the development of corporate structures and the myth of the intensively rationalized and rational society, Blacks became the irrational, the violent, criminal, caged beast. The cage was civilization and Western culture, obviously available to Blacks, but inexplicably beyond their grasp. Black historiography developed in opposition to this cloned thought and sensibility in American consciousness. This was not the intention, nor in its beginnings did it seem likely, since the first efforts at writing the history of the race had occurred some decades after the ending of ennobling literature that had accompanied the abolition movement. With the emancipation signed, there was no longer a demand for historical excursions into the Negro's African past to substantiate their inhumanity and irresistible degradation by slavery. The noble savage had ceased to have a function. but Reconstruction had rekindled the ideological attack on Black people. 60 years after the assault had been renewed, Du Bois would unhesitantly designate its source. The real frontal attack on Reconstruction, as interpreted by the leaders of national thought in 1870 and for some time thereafter, came from the universities. Their collective judgment of Black people, their silence and contempt, as Du Bois characterized it, became American history. And since men such as these were also intimately involved in the construction of the nation's agenda for the academic study of its political processes and structures, their shared assessment of Blacks was also a prescription. In order to paint the South as a martyr or inescapable fate, as the South as a martyr to inescapable fate, to make the North the magnanimous emancipator, and to ridicule the Negro as the impossible joke in the whole development we have in 50 years by libel, innuendo, and silence so completely misstated and obliterated the history of the Negro in America and his relation to its work and government that today it's almost unknown. It is not only part of foundation of our present lawlessness and loss of democratic ideals, it has more than that led the world to embrace and worship the color bar as social salvation, and is helping to range mankind in ranks of mutual hatred and contempt at the summons of cheap and false myth. Damn. I added that part, by the way, in case anybody's hearing this later. The damn is me. Anyway, it's good writing. Indeed, Du Bois would call this the propaganda of history. It is also a sadly humorous paradox that these very universities, which benefited or were even launched by profits from slavery, were still seen as insufficiently pro-slavery by Thomas Jefferson, inspiring him to found Virginia University as a specifically pro-slavery institution of higher education that he felt would be a Southern rival to Harvard. That's gangster. You can't be mad at the gangster. I mean, Thomas Jefferson was like, you're not pro-slavery enough. And we need to have a pro-slavery version of Harvard. Although Harvard was itself founded on, so I don't know. But that's what he say. Like Harvard itself, with all your slave money, it's not enough. You're just not aggressively pro-slavery enough. But returning briefly to Robinson, it was the Reconstruction era's assault on perceived Black progress. Oh, my bad. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry about that. But returning briefly to Robinson, it was the Reconstruction's era's assault on perceived Black progress that brought about fascinating responses from the Black intelligentsia. Responses, I think, are relevant to our moment now. Robinson describes an initial Black intellectual response to the brutality of Reconstruction that mirrored what was done during enslavement, and also in response to the newly formed unified approach to Blackness held by Northern and Southern writers, all trying to justify their post-Civil War positions and relationship to nominal Black freedom. Black intellectuals took a renewed promotional campaign promoting the value as citizens to the country that only formally held them in bondage. Once it was clear this tactic was of little value, a developing Black petty bourgeoisie, says Robinson, required a history that would at once absolve their guilt by association with the catastrophic ending of slavery, lend historical weight to the dignity they claimed as a class, and suggest their potential as participants in the country's future, end quote. Further, they required a Black historiography that would challenge their exclusion from the nation's racial parochialisms while settling for those very values. When their historiography did begin, it was not so much a bold initiative against the certainties of nationalist and racialist histories as it was a plea for sympathy. Black history thus began in the shadow of the national myths and as their dialectical negation. Consequently, it contained its own contradictions, e.g. the trivialization of social action, while enveloping those that occurred within dominant American history. Generations later, it would give rise to a more critical and truer opposition, but for the time being, it was to match American history in the coin of the realm, monument for monument, civilization for civilization, great man for great man. So I remember when I was a student at the then mighty Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University under the equally great and mighty Dr. James Turner, I took a course under the late great Ali Mazrui. And it was the only course I ever took with him at the time. And probably to this day, I didn't agree with him a lot. That whole triple heritage thing and the whole, but he was, I have to admit, I don't know if he was hustling me or us, but he at that point of his life, at least, he was just such a kind, gentle old man who, would come to lecture with his yellow, what were the old yellow paper pads, like old lecture notes that he had been using probably for decades. And he entertained like all the criticism, and he would let you push back, and he just would smile and, okay, and and keep it moving. I just thought he was great, and he hated on Henry Louis Gates too, so that was enough for me. But this part here from Robinson reminds me of what Ali Mazrui used to say about the difference between Leopold Senghor. I've never been able to say that man's name, Senghor, and Cheikh Anta Diop. Whereas Cheikh Anta Diop, so Senghor had negrescence and was saying, we don't have what European civilization has had, and we don't need it. We have our own beautiful blackness. And Diop said, we have our beautiful blackness, but we have done everything Europeans have done civilizationally. We did all of that. Africans did all of that. This sounds kind of like the difference to me in what Robinson was talking about here in terms of that early Black historiography that was just trying to say, hey, white folks, thanks for stopping this enslavement, and let us prove to you how we can earn your respect. We're not going to focus on the radicalism and and again, I think like Peniel Joseph and Zahir Ali and scholars like that, when they talk about Malcolm and Kwame Ture, they're doing today's that version today. They're doing today's version of that. We're going to talk about some of these uncomfortable people, but not in a way, we're talking about it in a way that praises what America has given us as an opportunity to advance and become, to radicalize American democracy. And we're going to suppress the rebelliousness, the tendencies towards rebellion. And certainly in terms of what we encourage and what we show respect to, Anyway, of course, for us today, it is worth further highlighting Robinson's point that it was the national structure of universities that from which much of the intellectual production and thrust against Black humanity originated, was propelled, given license. And it has been against that backdrop that Robinson describes the dialectical negation of clamoring for a sympathetic entrance into a society they desired. And while later, still following Robinson, there would be a more radical and aggressive historiography, it is this moment to which I think we have both returned and never fully left. That is, in a far more obscure and insidious way, aided by a wildly destabilizing media environment, a point to which I will return momentarily, Black historiography still struggles within an advanced colonial context to negate society's denials of access while still clamoring for a sympathetic recognition of value historically, and today often by rebranding revolutionary politics, individuals, and histories as merely trying to transform American democracy. My bad, everybody. I didn't even realize how much I had already said all this. My bad. It's so ingrained. That's what it is. Recent histories from traditional scholars, supplemented by a rising social media punditry class, have, for example, attempted to recast Malcolm X and Kwame Ture as Democratic Party liberals whose support for neoliberal establishment Barack Obama's presidency was axiomatic, while others have captured the reparations imagination of many by rebranding its radical potential along more conservative lines while using claims of American citizenship as an abandonment of Black liberation traditions as a basis for their argument and approach. In other words, soda. That's all you got to say. All of that is just soda. This is what our fight today looks like in a sophisticated neo-colonial arrangement, where we see so much of that dialectical attempt at various negations against being cast. Oh man, I was trying to be funny there too, but it only works if you're reading it. as the irrational caged beast in the era of corporate structure and claimed rationality. In other words, today, Robinson's description of a Black intellectual need to match American history in the coin of the realm would now include the need to rebrand previous revolutionary attempts at restructure and redistribution as merely immature, primitive, and to be improved upon with loud calls of allegiance to the state. Similarly, and concomitantly, the national systems of media and communication, both in their study and deployment, very much evolved too within these same universities as, again, forms of domination. These studies would take on the very nature of the political, economic, intellectual, and deep state leadership from which their calls into being came. As Carl Deutsch has described, as former colonies around the world sought independence in the middle of the 20th century, as Deutsch has described, as former colonies around the world sought independence in the middle of the 20th century, the US and Western systems of communication were being developed as, quote, supranational methods of imposing colonizing interests into media environment of target populations around the world. Hence, Dr. Huey Newton's righteous proclamation that there were no nations to which we can any longer hope to decolonize, given in part the militarized reach of US communications technologies. This would, of course, include the development of digital and satellite technology, and in particular, the privatization and mass deployment of military communications technology, itself rebranded as a net positive, pun intended, for society. I see me trying to be funny. This internet media, which can only be understood ironically as social, has by now become the filthy exponent of initial national philosophy of communication as domination. The target audience has certainly become the intended pliant, atomized, isolated consumer of ads, propaganda, and psychological warfare sought by the shapers of our environment from the start. Borders and privacy, material and immaterial alike, from crossings to consciousness, have all become figments of an imagination that itself is likely not our own. It is true that universities play a tremendous role in shaping minds that may support the most radical projects, but that is not their intent or purpose. For Robinson, their role was to shape national will against a liberated human citizen designated variously as African, Negro, Black, and worse, now informs her without the possibility of avoidance simply due to 3 elite conglomerates owned and run by the wealthiest white men determining the pop cultural taste of 12 to 18-year-olds on the planet. And it is crazy how 3 white men, maybe 4, have had an inordinate role to play. I'm thinking of Lucian Grange, Lear Cohen, Leo Blavatnik. I'm thinking of Clive Davis. I'm thinking of that might be it. I guess you could add your Tommy Mottolas and your Jimmy Iovines, but like those white men have had more to say over the Black national discussion of the use of the N-word than anybody singularly within the Black community itself. Ooh. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I'll come back to the chat in a little bit to see how right you all think I am on that. But I think I am right on that. That they have had more influence over young Black people, or Black people, period, self-referencing with the N-word than definitely any individual Black person. And maybe more than the community itself. But, anyway. For Chris Simpson, the university was the warehouse for the state and intelligence agency development of propaganda and psychological warfare. For Frances Stoner Saunders, they were but a smaller part of a larger Western post-war shaping of the globe along capitalist logic. And it is her summary of one of those shapers' statements that I'd like to have help segue to shift toward a conclusion here, because it is the insidiousness and reach that Saunders' work speaks so strongly to that perfectly situates the moment we are in. The use of communication with targeted design to manipulate, be it called propaganda, public relations, psychological warfare, and operations, marketing, advertising, or strategic communication, ultimately is meant to create an environment, one, as Marshall McLuhan says, makes us fish who haven't discovered water, as it has always been beyond our perception, that will govern in relative anonymity and obscurity. It sets a tone. So then, as Saunders says, quote, it is not a matter of buying off and subverting individual writers and scholars, but of setting up an arbitrary and factitious system of values by which academic personnel were advanced, magazine editors appointed, and scholars subsidized and published, not necessarily on their merits, though these were sometimes considerable, but of their allegiance, but because of their allegiance. It is not a matter of buying off and subverting individual writers and scholars. It's more important that it be set up an arrangement of arbitrary and factitious system of values by which academic personnel were advanced, magazine editors appointed, and scholars subsidized and published. They may have merit, but it's not because of that, as she says, it's because of their allegiance. She's still 100% right. I hate to say it, but it is, build it and they will come. Put differently and more recently, when a report was done about the relationship between the current White House and Fox News, the founder of the network, Rupert Murdoch, was considered as having invented Trump. But no, as the story said, Murdoch didn't invent Trump, but he invented the audience. Murdoch was going to make a Trump exist. When Trump comes along, sees all these people and says, I'll be the ringmaster in your circus. Then Trump comes along, sees all these people and says, I'll be the ringmaster of your circus. And this is where we most certainly are on a grand scale. We are all the invented audience now prepared to accept so much of what is clearly wrong, to accept, participate in, and welcome the created circus. Centuries of that dialectical effort at negation, and then, as Tom Porter says, being the negation of the negation, has many Black scholars accepting that class role Robinson described, a willingness to limit or be limited in our political responses and forms of our scholarship. A second reconstruction, as my comrade says, has many of us still fighting back with attempts to reconcile systemic and systematic oppression of Black people with claims that our movements have only been meant to become part of what is, and willing to accept that academic freedom really only means rewards or fancy chicken. All right, so that was goes to those who remain free within the strict and prescribed boundaries. So the fancy chicken line is me making reference to something that somebody at this gathered there wanted me to make a reference to. So I worked it in. Anyway, it requires little more than simply selecting carefully who is on television, appointed to highest posts, allowed enormous salaries to not teach, and assuring that those who do are paid the least, never given time or room to produce intellectually or to be known beyond their immediate classrooms. This is an important point for me. Again, I'm sorry, I cannot stop. I will never stop with this. The highest paid scholars in academia do not teach, or teach the least, I should say. So again, what does that automatically say about the value of those who do teach, or the value of teaching? I think it says a lot. It says either we value what we really want people to learn and be able to drill down on. We will allow an inordinate amount of focus on logically. So we will give the more prominent superstars fewer classes and more ability to hone in on what their worldview is, and is so well funded and given, only in limited relatively portions, to students. And those of us who teach the most students are forced to do so with the least amount of ability to hone in and drill down on our preferred perspectives or work or whatever. I don't know. It says more than that, but I'll just stop there for now. Dr. Favors does reach a conclusion in his aforementioned new book that helps explain some of what causes both our HBCU relative academic and student malaise as it relates to activism in critical scholarship. Simply put, in a version described more broadly by a recent documentary about the American university, the state starved the beast. Money for social science and humanities have dried up in comparison to those in STEM-related fields. So those of us within liberal arts are underfunded. Those fields are underfunded, and those who are in science, technology, engineering, and math are overfunded. Those fields, of course, lend themselves far more to military and intelligence agency needs and far less to those of material and social conditions of the communities from which students come. When Fanon talked of it being necessary that the colonized be denied even the right to dream of liberty, he was certainly not joking. By creating a precipitous drop in financial support for intellectualism, worlds of ideas and critical thinking we have mostly seen worlds of ideas and critical thinking we have mostly seen an overt attempt to return to, or the recreation of a contemporary industrial system of education buttressed by a media system so meticulously shaped to as appear natural and inevitable. And it is a testimony to the hard work, struggle, and basic humanity of so many things that are just not worse. You know what? That's bad writing. This is my point. This is not good. That line, that's too confused. Anyway, but I get what I'm saying. By creating a precipitous drop in financial support for intellectualism, worlds of ideas and critical thinking, right. So by underfunding critical thinking, we just see anyway, it makes it harder for people to develop the kind of radical analyses that we need. That's all. That was just poor writing. Nice. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll close with the words from Doctors Ruth Perry and Yarden Katz of MIT from a recent edition of the Chronicle of Higher Education. If indeed it is true that when white people catch a cold, we get pneumonia, then what she has to say about the broader national tendency at the university should prepare us further if we are not clear already for war. That is also, man, this is, I think I did not finish strong. You're supposed to finish strong, and I don't think I finished strong here. First of all, it's two of them, so I don't know why I said she. So what they write, that is Perry and Katz, about the state of higher education should be clear about what we need to be preparing for. At the university prepares further if we're not clear for war. Then what we have to say about the broader national tendency at the university prepares further if we are not clear already for war. We should be prepared for war is, I think, the point I'm getting at here. Anyway, Perry and Katz say, quote, universities have been transformed to run like corporations, top down and hierarchical, relying on impersonal bureaucracies rather than collegial debate to make decisions. Research is viewed instrumentally as it is at the corporations that sponsor it. The line between education and business has all but dissolved. Corporations lease campus land for all their commercial buildings and help direct research in campus labs. The atmosphere encourages students to work on their pitches for corporate jobs rather than identify problematic assumptions. Students' imaginations are trained to develop new products and open new markets rather than to think about what would constitute human fulfillment. We end up reproducing the view that the real world is inevitably one of competition, anxiety, isolation, and fear. Yet such propaganda is now simply part of the academic science. Media outlets that cover science play a major role in this distortion. As the sociologist Dorothy Nelkin put it, most press coverage crafts an image of science as an objective pursuit, an instrument for unending progress to the benefit of all. Criticism of how the scientific enterprise actually works and affects people's lives is nearly absent. Scientists, particularly at elite institutions, aren't innocently co-opted into these schemes, but are skillful participants who, as Nelkin wrote in her book in 1987, Selling Science, employ increasingly sophisticated public relations techniques to assure that their interests are represented with maximum media appeal. Conflict of interest does not capture the current state of affairs, which is better described as one of shared interests among universities, corporations, and the military. Working with big pharma, launching startups, and obtaining Pentagon grants are what make an elite American scientist. MIT helped to normalize a model of research that exemplifies the knotty military-industrial academic complex. The MIT Media Lab is funded by member companies who in exchange receive intellectual property rights to the laboratory's work. The members list include powerful corporations from nearly every ethically challenged industry: fossil fuels, ExxonMobil, Big Pharma, Novartis, Hoffman, LaRouche, Takeda, Big Tech, Google, Twitter, IBM, Intel, Cisco, weapons developers, Northrop Grumman, and big media, 21st Century Fox, Comcast, Verizon. Recently, the Stevens Point campus at the University of Wisconsin proposed to cut 13 of its humanities majors, including English, art, history, philosophy, and foreign languages. Language is the repository of our most subtle thoughts and noble feelings, the medium that stores our common knowledge and folklore, but no one has figured out how to commodify it yet. Closing research departments in the humanities is also an attack on labor. It converts programs with tenured faculty slots into service departments based on even more precarious contract labor that teach basic skills to students in more strategically profitable programs. And so another crack where academic resistance could take place is sealed shut. End quote. Now, and in fact, part of what that misunderstood increased contradiction, the pneumonia that is that now, and in fact, part of that misunderstood increased contradiction of pneumonia is that the languages of African people and of Black America in particular have indeed been made into commodity. So this is where I just kind of disagreed with that, a little bit of that last, section there. The scholars I quoted. But anyway, the hip hop nation language once spoken of by James Spady has absolutely been turned to colonial weaponry, testifying against its progenitors, creating billions globally for those same conglomerates, while the communities from which the art is mined remain cordoned spatially and economically and absent any meaningful political control or anything akin to sovereignty. I've hoped here today to simply return our focus in some way directly to the central role played of propaganda myth to the maintenance of an intentionally designed, horrifically unequal country and world. My preference for this particular colonial framework, though also wonderful for closing gaps between often competing material and immaterial emphases of analysis, is today helpful in describing the intent of power and the context created by that intent in which we who are struggling find ourselves. For there to be any honest assessment where we are today as Black scholars or scholars at Black universities, I have hoped to offer up for consideration the created interpretive environment in which our own work and ideas are then themselves considered. What created audiences are we then finding in our classrooms or at the other end of our completed works? What are the nature of the decisions made regarding distribution of salaries, funding, and faculty governance? And why do so many HBCUs in particular find themselves outside what are at times thought to be conventional processes or governing practices? Or even why, when I once upon a time sought answers to compelling questions raised regarding hiring, pay, seniority, academic freedom, assaults on terminal degrees, and full adoption of teaching hospital models of commercial education, was I told verbatim, quote, Dr. Ball, your problem is that you want to create new knowledge. We don't do that here. Your job is to create menial laborers for the communications industry, end quote. This was merely an honest assessment of our moment, absent the broader context I've tried briefly to outline today, and one I know does not confront me alone. Thank you, and in the words of Fred Hampton, peace to those willing to fight for it. And that's it. So some bad writing aside, I think, I appreciate that, Coco. I did try. Some edits could have gone through another edit, No, yeah, yeah, yeah. I did see one. So yeah, my CV has some stuff on it, but but you would have to look more carefully to see what I'm talking about. And so I'm not saying this to be like falsely humble or or to even be overly self-deprecating or whatever. It's just the reality of the situation. There, within an academic context, I have too few single author publications. I have too few single author publications on university presses. And when you look at the uh, amount of reference of work of just even contemporary scholars, I'm not even putting myself up against like legends long gone. It's not as, it's just doesn't rank as high. Um, Now, I can make certain arguments for that. I mean, there's some justification for it. I think that the work I have done politically is outside the lanes or the lines, and wouldn't, I have shared even, and I used to. It's been more than a year now, but usually about once a year, I get an email or some sort of a call or a text sometimes from someone who will say something like, off the record, I appreciate your work, but there's no way I'm referencing this. Like literally. So, but what that does, and I get it, because it wouldn't be seen as a viable source, or wouldn't be seen as, it would be seen as making an argument that no one wants to make or few people want to make or whatever. Uh, but what it also does is it sort of suppresses, you know, um, we were just talking about him the other day. Malefi Asante is, for whatever you want to say about his work, he's one of the most referenced scholars in Black studies. So I'm not even putting myself up against that. I'm just thinking of how this works. So even with the amount of criticism that he may get, the fact that he's referenced so much puts him at a status of, just puts him at a certain status. So anyway, yeah. So I just don't, I have to be real about what I've, and then I have to also be real, like the written work, it's right. It's even seminal. But as I've talked about, like when we did the 10th anniversary about the mixtape manifesto, it's not, it's just, it doesn't hit certain heights. Anyway, so again, I appreciate what you're saying there, but I'm just trying to be real about what the thinking in terms of academia. And then at the same time, so not only, I mean, I do sort of, not as much as I'd like, but I do read journals. I do serve on a couple of editorial boards. So I from time to time I see the scholarship being produced, and there are a lot of sharp young folks, and there are a lot of sharp young folks who don't have my politics. So if you're looking at a hire, you know, you can easily find younger, my age and older scholars. You could find anybody. There's plenty of scholars that people can find who hit those check marks. They get more funding. I haven't raised a lot of money. I don't think. Yeah, I don't bring in a lot of grant money. I don't. So when I'm thinking about what would make me, a top tier candidate for these top tier academic jobs, you got to bring in a lot of money. You have to have university press publications. You have to get referenced a lot. You have to have, there is sort of a blue checkification in academia. It's kind of like the guy, for getting that blue check on Twitter or Instagram. You got to, other big timers have to reference you. So there's a and this is why I have called out a couple of people here and there, not because I think my work is superior sometimes, but because if you know me, if you know my work, and all you would have to do is say, just throw me in the bibliography or reference, you don't even have to say like Dr. Ball said, da, 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 da. but you know my work is relevant. You know, and then when you send me a message and you say, as has happened, man, I really you've inspired this work. Will you interview me on your platform because you've inspired this work? And then I look in the work and my name doesn't appear anywhere. I've called people out. How can you say that? Because they know the game too. By not referencing me, you make it harder for me professionally. You hurt my feelings. And then you come back directly and then you tell me you were influenced the work. And I see that I have, or I see that I should be referenced here, or I see that it would make sense. I'm like, So my point is, anyway, I've said too much, but my point really is I get it. Like I get why I'm not at a certain level. I haven't earned it. I have no problem acknowledging that. But I also, think that there are others who, well, because they need to help me. Man, you really, but when you referenced all the people who did that kind of work, you didn't put my name in there. And then you see people who reference the same people all the time. And that's how, anyway, so there's a hustle behind that. So anyway, I'm just trying to be honest about where I think I see myself. So I get it. But I appreciate the compliments, and I'm looking to see if there's any, anybody's any particular comments or questions that, otherwise, the chat stays vigorous. Yeah, a lot of sharp folks don't have the politics, but they're sharp. So if you're hiring, why would you want that radical nonsense when you can get plenty of people with the right CVs? Yeah, I mean, you gotta what the game is. You know how it. Other academic. Everybody knows what the game is. Put the. You know what I mean? Because I get the calls like even for this, the call was, I think you'll hit the right notes that we can't hit here. Yeah, the fancy chicken, the context was, I don't remember all the details, but it believe me, when I said it in the room that day, it reverberated. There was like people felt the and that's JARED, my good person. No, I'm just playing. But the article's linked in the show notes. Yeah, no doubt, David. I agree. Part of the statement about requires Black authority, but not an authority. I speak from behind the curtain. Yeah. And then I said, Dr. Burroughs was standing and having a conversation behind me, so he says he didn't hear it, and I know that was the intent of Zahir Ali when he said it. But when what Zahir Ali said to me on the corner that day outside of Al Jazeera, does this? I mean, he spoke he said what does they say? You said the quiet part out loud. He said, I don't, his point was, I don't want to be disassociated from the Marable book on Malcolm X, not because I deserve more credit, because he said Marable did all the work on his own, or bulk of it. But he said, but I want to build my own brand. So, that's why when we had Dr. Cornel West on, I had to take that little shot at him, because you had Zahir Ali on multiple times to talk about that monstrosity of a work about Malcolm X, and didn't have us on even once. And that would have been great. Because even if you disagree with us, the fact that you have us on your platform, obviously within certain realms of academia, gives you some credibility. And West was doing a podcast with Bob Avakian. So, what threat could I be politically if you're doing a show with Bob Avakian, who's supposedly such a threat to the United States that he can't even come back in the country? Yeah, we do have a fire chat. So, and again, you know, as I start to wrap up here, if I've missed anything, obviously you all, the link to is in the show notes as well, but continue the conversation in the Discord. Shout out to Emma Vol. She's been really tightening it up. There's a lot of great space there. So like all this great stuff in the chat, you know. Yeah, Dr. West goes everywhere. I mean, he's invited everywhere. But I say this with no, you know, no, I don't know, like no intent to falsely brag or whatever on our behalf. But the interview that Cornel West did with us, he has never done an interview like that anywhere. I've seen him all over the place. And I defy anyone to send us and show me where he's done an interview like he did here. It would be very hard to read. It would be very hard to because Kamal Kalanji and myself represent academically, activist wise, a lot of history in a lot of different spaces. For us three to come together in an interview with Cornel West, like that has like bringing that kind of perspective that, or those, it's never happened. It's never happened. You might be interested in this hosted Council on Foreign Relations featuring Tony Allen, webinar role of it. Oh, I would be. Please drop the link. I'm very interested in what the Council for Foreign Relations has to say about HBCUs. Yeah, I appreciate that. Please, if you know. Oh, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And definitely as you read it or after you read it, check the 10th anniversary video for a discussion of its history and thoughts on it, you know. Anyway, I mean, Dr., you know, he handles himself well. He handled it. But that's the point. Like Dr. West knows all the traditions and the histories. Like he knows, and he's been willing historically to put himself in spaces where there are people to his left. So I've always given him credit for that. Unlike a lot of other people in his relative position. Yeah, I've never listened. Trisha Rose's Black Noise, I remember as being like this pivotal turning point, brilliant. I still remember, like, she talked about the revolutions made on a turntable equate to something about the revolutions in Black. There was some dope she did with that. It's been a long time since I looked at that. But she did her early hip hop work. I thought was really good. The Hip Hop Wars book, I think, is a terrible departure from that. And I haven't read anything from her since then. But it's basically, I mean, yeah. Hey, shout out to oh, what's my man's name? I just went blank, but I always got to connect him to it. Bracy, Dr. Bracy at UMass, when he was at the Cornell Center, Africana Center, paying tribute to Dr. Turner, he told us, go read William Corson's work on the HBCU. And I did. And I think we've talked about it a number of times here, but that's the point, that William Corson, this white man coming out of the military, coming out of the, support, I don't know what, wanting exactly, but he took a job at Howard University and wanted to study the potential for the Black Revolution to take effect on HBCU's campuses. It reads like an honest assessment from his worldview of the threat, and then you could start to see why some of what I talked about, and even today, would have taken place, because he talked about that. More or less, that there was this possibility that the streets could take over the campuses. That is, the movement in the streets could take over students, and that they could become a problem, even in terms of armed guerrilla warfare, armed combat. So you could see why there would be this move, and it would be slick. That's slick. I actually think that's a pretty impressive move to say we'll just defund liberal arts. Oh, you want Black studies? Okay, cool. We'll just defund. You can have it. We're just going to pull the plug on it financially. We're even seeing some of it at Morgan. They want to collapse some departments in liberal arts. I think some have already. I got to get caught up on that actually. And a lot of the funding does go to STEM fields where you could see where it would be more difficult to develop a radical consciousness. Yeah. Tony Allen is the chair of President's Board of Advisors. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, Tim Wise is getting that. I mean, I remember I was on a and then I'll wrap here, but I was on a I had been invited somewhere. Where was I don't know. I can't. Some years ago, I was invited somewhere, and I was on to give a presentation, but I was like the day after the keynote presentation, and I was there for the keynote, and I was watching the keynote, and I mean he was all right. I mean he was all right. I mean it was just all right, but what I'll never forget is that he said something like, it was a passing remark. He said, I give like 50 of these lectures a year, 30 to 50 of these lectures a year, and blah, 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 blah. And I started thinking about, I was like 30 to 50. And then I did the math and I said, well, I think I had gotten paid like $1,500, which is, for me, that's pretty high. I know he was at least 3, 4, 5, 6 times, maybe 10 times that. And I started doing the math and I was like, wow, if he's doing 30 to 50 of these, even at my pay, it's a racket. I had never even thought of it like that. But there are people who clearly intend to supplement their salaries with this presentation speakers thing. And I think sometimes they write things just to get back on those tours, which was my critique of Trisha Rose's Hip Hop Wars at the time. I was like, she's trying to get back as a top hip hop pundit speaker, spokesperson, trying to get back on that, Oh no. I remember when Peniel Joseph came to Morgan State years ago, before we had fully gotten into our back and forth, and I was just kind of looking at him like, I think you would probably. I remember he came to Morgan and I went up to him after he gave his presentation and I said to him, I said, I think we disagree on some of this. I just want to introduce myself. I think we disagree. Maybe we could talk a little bit. And he said I think he had gotten paid like $6,000. And he said that was his HBCU discount. And I remember thinking $6,000. I was like, have I ever been paid $6,000? I don't think I've ever been paid $6,000 for anything, beyond a salary. Nah, once or twice, maybe. Once? I don't know, man. I don't know. But the point that was his discount. Yeah, just $6,000 to give an hour. And from my humble perspective, it wasn't dope. It was not a dope hour. It was, but the flip side is I'm not mad at them. Particularly these big universities, they got a lot of money. If you can, I get it. But yeah. I remember Dr. Burroughs, he wasn't talking about Trisha Rose, but he was saying he never bought in that hip hop studies stuff. Oh no, he thought he was doing us a favor. He was like, I know you can't afford me, Morgan. And he's probably right. Although I don't know, man. I saw somebody got paid. I don't know. Some of these cats get paid. I don't know. Maybe Morgan, and I don't know. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.